The city was alive with its usual rhythm. The honking of impatient drivers, the chatter of street vendors, the hurried footsteps of people who always seemed late for something. Yet, in the midst of all that noise, there was one corner where time slowed down. Beneath the dull yellow glow of a flickering streetlight sat a man most passers-by tried not to notice. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed and split at the seams, and his one strong frame had thinned from too many hungry nights. A battered leather satchel rested at his side, its edges frayed, its surface scarred by years of use. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another forgotten soul swallowed by the city's indifference. But if you stopped, even for a moment, you would see something extraordinary. At his feet, on the cracked pavement, sat a small circle of children. Some wore jackets too big for their bodies. Others wore shirts with holes patched over and over again. Their notebooks were made from scraps of paper, their pencils chewed down to tiny stubs. Yet their eyes were wide, alive, hungry, not for food, but for knowledge. The man's name was Daniel Carter. Once, long ago, Daniel had stood in front of a polished blackboard, inside a classroom with neatly arranged desks. He had been Mr. Carter, the kind of teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who believed that even the most overlooked kid could shine if given a chance. But now, the only blackboard here was a small, cracked slate propped up against a brick wall. With a stub of chalk clutched tightly between his fingers, he bent low, sketching numbers and letters in hurried strokes, his voice calm but filled with conviction. Education, he told them, isn't about where you sit. It's about what you carry here. He tapped his chest. And here, he touched his head. A little girl, no older than 8, raised her hand. Her hair was tied back with a piece of red ribbon that had faded to pink. Mr. Carter, why do you teach us out here? Don't teachers of schools? For a brief second, his hand froze on the chalkboard. His eyes flickered, not with anger, but with a deep sadness that words could not hold. And then, just as quickly, he smiled. Because, sweetheart, he said softly, a classroom could be anywhere the mind is open. The children nodded, some scribbling eagerly on scraps of paper, others just listening, soaking up every word. Around them, the city bustled, uncaring, stepping over this little island of hope as though it didn't exist. People glanced their way, some shaking their heads, others whispering. A few pulled out their phones to snap pictures before walking off, as if recording curiosity to show later. Most didn't stop, most didn't care. But that night, something different happened. Among the usual stream of pedestrians, one boy lingered. His sneakers were worn, his jeans too short for his growing legs, and his backpack looked older than he was. He hovered at the edge of the circle, uncertain, his dark eyes darting nervously between the children and the man with the chalk. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. "Come in, son," he said gently, motioning with his hand. "There's room for one more." The boy hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, and for a moment, Daniel wondered if he would run. But slowly, cautiously, the boy stepped forward and sat cross-legged at the edge of the group. "Welcome," Daniel said with a warm smile, as though the boy had been expected all along. "What's your name?" The boy whispered it so softly that Daniel had to lean in to catch it. "Malik." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. There was something in Malik's eyes, something different, a weight, perhaps, or a quiet fire that had not yet found his voice. Daniel recognized it instantly. It was the same look he had seen in countless children before, back when his life had been different, back when he had a classroom and a steady paycheck, and a reputation that had not yet been shattered. But this time was different. This boy, this night, Daniel felt it in his bones. Something was beginning. The lesson continued. But Daniel found himself glancing at Malik again and again. Each time, he saw the boy's gaze fixed on him. Not distracted, not restless, but fully present, absorbing every word. It reminded Daniel the truth he clung to even in his darkest nights. That knowledge could spark even in the most broken places. And though the world had cast him aside, though society had forgotten his name and his worth, Daniel Carter still believed in one thing with all his heart. If he could reach just one child, just one, everything he had lost would mean something again. What he didn't know was that the boy who sat silently on the pavement that night, the boy named Malik, would not only change his life, but would change everything. Daniel Carter had not always been a man with chalk-stained fingers crouched on a sidewalk. There was a time, not so long ago, when he walked through school hallways where his footsteps echoed with respect, not pity. Students had called him Mr. Carter, with a mix of affection and admiration. Parents trusted him. Colleagues envied his patience. Principals praised his passion. He had once been that teacher, the one who stayed long after the dismissal bell, who gave up weekends to coach debate teams or tutor kids who others had already written off. He had believed, with every fiber of his being, that teaching was not a profession, but a calling. But life, Daniel knew, had a way of tearing down even the strongest foundations. It began quietly. Budget cuts that slashed programs he loved, administrators more concerned with test scores and children's souls. Then came the personal storm. His wife's illness, the bills that stacked higher than his modest teacher salary could bear. Nights became battles with worry. Mornings became marathons of exhaustion. And when she passed, something inside him cracked. He tried to hold on. He showed up, he smiled, he taught. But grief shadowed every word. Students whispered. Parents complained. His once stellar reputation began to crumble under rumors he could not fight and mistakes he could not undo. And then one false accusation, one administrative review that went the wrong way. And just like that, the man who had dedicated his life to shaping young minds found himself jobless. Jobless became homeless. Homeless became invisible. Yet through it all, Daniel clung to one thing: teaching. If he couldn't have a classroom, he would make one wherever he stood. And so the streets became his chalkboard, and the city's forgotten children became his students. It was there, on that cracked pavement, that Malik first appeared. Malik had always been a watcher. At 13, he had already learned that life punished those who drew too much attention. His mother worked double shifts. His father was gone, and the streets taught him lessons no school could. How to dodge trouble, how to stretch a single meal into two, how to read the moods of men bigger and meaner than him. School had never been his refuge. Teachers labeled him distracted, lazy, troubled. The truth was, Malik's mind was sharp, too sharp. He saw through false smiles and hollow encouragements. He knew when someone cared, and when they didn't. So when he first stumbled upon Daniel's makeshift class under the streetlight, Malik had no intention of staying. He had paused only out of curiosity, one foot already angled to leave. But then he had heard the man's voice, not the tired mechanical tone of most teachers, but a voice that carried warmth, conviction, belief. And that was what made him sit down. The second night, Malik returned. This time he came closer. Daniel noticed the shift, but said nothing, only continued the lesson with the same gentle energy. They read from a battered book of poetry, Daniel's voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the words. Poetry, Daniel explained, is proof that even the smallest voice can echo forever. Malik said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with something like recognition, as though a part of him long buried stirred at those words. By the third night, Malik was no longer lingering at the edge. He sat among the children, pencil in hand, scribbling fiercely on scraps of paper. Daniel watched with quiet satisfaction. He knew better than to push. Trust was not demanded. It was earned. Still, there were questions he could not ignore. Who was this boy? Why did he come alone? And why did Daniel feel, deep in his bones, that Malik was different, that he was meant for something more? One evening, after the lesson ended and the younger children scampered home, Malik stayed behind. The street had quieted, and the flickering lamp buzzed faintly above them. "You don't get paid for this," Malik said suddenly. His voice was low, almost accusatory. Daniel looked at him. "No." "Then why do you do it?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. Daniel thought of all the answers he could give, the noble, rehearsed ones he had offered reporters in the rare times someone noticed his work. But standing there, looking at this boy with guarded eyes and clenched fists, Daniel chose the truth. "Because teaching is who I am," he said simply. "And because kids like you deserve someone who won't give up on them." Malik didn't reply. His jaw tightened, his gaze dropped to the ground. But in that silence, Daniel saw it. The smallest crack in the boy's armor, a flicker of something raw and unspoken. That night, as Daniel packed up his satchel, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Not the kind that blazed and burned out, but the kind that glowed quietly, steadily, like embers waiting to ignite. He did not know it yet, but Malik was not just another student. Malik was the beginning of a story Daniel thought he no longer had the strength to write. And in time, the boy's presence would not only challenge him, it would force Daniel to confront his past, his pain, and the possibility that redemption was still within reach. Because sometimes, it only takes one student to remind a teacher why they were born to teach. The first time Daniel saw Malik flinch, it was over something small. A car horn blared from the street, sharp and sudden. The younger children laughed and covered their ears, but Malik jerked as if someone had struck him. His shoulders hunched. His eyes darted left, right, searching, bracing. Daniel didn't mention it then. Years in the classroom had taught him that some silences should not be broken too soon. But that night, as Malik scribbled notes on a wrinkled page, Daniel noticed the boy's knuckles, raw, bruised, like they had met concrete too many times. Something wasn't right. Malik lived in a one-bedroom apartment with his mother, though lived was too generous a word. His mother's presence was a blur, a shadow stretched thin between double shifts and exhaustion. She was rarely home, and when she was, her voice carried the fatigue of someone who had long ago given up the luxury of dreams. Malik's father was a ghost, sometimes rumored to be across town, sometimes in jail, sometimes just gone. Malik never asked, never cared. The streets had become his inheritance. And on those streets, boys his age learned fast that survival wasn't about being the smartest. It was about being the hardest. At school, Malik's teachers barely said his name. He was statistic, low grade, skip classes, trouble brewing. The ones who noticed him only saw a problem. The ones who didn't notice at all might have been worse. But Daniel noticed. Each evening, Malik came earlier and stayed later. He started asking questions. Tentative at first, then hungry, like a boy's starved for answers. Why do they say history repeats itself? What's the point of reading something that's not real? Do you think people ever really change? Daniel never rushed his replies. He answered carefully, weaving lessons into conversations, turning the boys' questions into discoveries. Sometimes he used stories from history. Other times he spoke from his own pain. And though Malik rarely reacted with more than a grunt or a shrug, Daniel could see the impact. The boy was listening. One evening, when the lesson ended, Daniel slid a worn paperback across the pavement. It was To Kill a Mockingbird, its cover creased, its pages annotated with Daniel's own notes. "This one's yours now," Daniel said. Malik frowned at it, as though holding a book was dangerous. "I'm not good at reading." Daniel smiled. "Then let's find out how good you can get." Malik didn't answer, but he took the book. A week later, Daniel found him reading under the flickering streetlight, lips moving silently, finger trailing the lines. The sight nearly undid him, because this was why he had never stopped teaching. But growth never came without struggle. One night, Malik didn't show. Then another, and another. Daniel sat on the cold pavement, his chalk untouched, watching the street where Malik usually appeared. The younger children chattered around him, but he could not shake the weight in his chest. Something was wrong. On the fourth night, Malik returned. His hoodie was torn at the sleeve, his lips swollen. He dropped heavily onto the pavement, his silence sharper than any words. Daniel wanted to ask. He wanted to demand answers. But he had learned long ago that some truths could not be forced. Instead, he began the lesson as if nothing had happened. He spoke of resilience, of how even the tallest trees bend in storms but never broke. And though Malik said nothing, his shoulders eased just a little. Later, when the others had gone, Malik finally spoke. "They jumped me." His voice was flat, but beneath it was rage, a quiet, dangerous rage. Daniel waited. "Some older guys said I was weak, said I didn't belong." Malik's hands tightened into fists. "I wanted to fight back. I almost did. But I remember what you said. about how strength isn't always about hitting harder. Daniel's chest tightened. In that moment, he realized Malik wasn't just hearing his lessons, he was living them. Weeks passed. Malik began to change in ways small but unmistakable. He asked for extra reading. He stayed after lessons to practice math problems. He even started helping the younger kids, guiding them through letters and numbers with seriousness that surprised Daniel. But the world outside their circle was not so forgiving. At school, teachers still saw him as a troublemaker. On the streets, gangs still saw him as prey. His mother, though loving in her own weary way, was too consumed by survival to notice the boy her son was becoming. And so Daniel became the anchor. One evening, as Malik packed his things, Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got a mind that can change the world," he said softly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Malik froze. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought he had overstepped, but then the boy nodded once. Barely, almost imperceptibly, and that single nod carried more weight than 1,000 words. Still, shadows lingered. Daniel knew the story was only beginning. The boy was climbing, but the climb was steep and storms still gathered overhead. He also knew something else, something he hadn't admitted, even to himself. Malik wasn't just changing. He was changing Daniel. The winter air was sharper now, the kind that sliced through jackets and gnawed at bones. But Daniel still came, as he always did, kneeling on the cracked pavement with chalk in hand, waiting for the children to gather. Only tonight, the crowd was smaller. Parents had pulled their kids inside, fearful of the fights breaking out 2 blocks away. The city felt tense, restless, as if something dangerous was about to snap. Daniel's eyes kept drifting toward the street corner. Malik hadn't come. Malik was in trouble. He had been circling danger for weeks, but now it was at his heels. The gang that had beaten him before wasn't finished. They had given him an ultimatum: join them or pay the price. And this time, they weren't speaking in threats. They had shown him what happened to boys who said no. Blood on pavement, mothers weeping. Malik had been strong before, but fear had a way of chipping at even the toughest resolve. And as much as Daniel's words echoed in his mind, another voice whispered louder, "You're alone. No one can save you." When Malik finally appeared at the street school, Daniel knew something was wrong. His walk was different, stiff, deliberate. His hood was pulled low, as if he didn't want to be seen. "Malik," Daniel greeted softly, but the boy avoided his eyes. He sat in silence through the lesson, staring at the ground. When the other children left, Daniel stayed. "Talk to me," he urged. Malik's jaw tightened. For a long moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a sudden burst, the words spilled out. "They want me in. They said I don't get another chance. And if I say no again," his voice cracked, "they'll kill me." The words hit Daniel like a blow. He had known Malik was struggling, but hearing aloud, hearing the raw terror behind it, was something else entirely. "No," Daniel said firmly. "You're not going down that road. You don't get it." Malik snapped, his eyes flashing. "You get to walk away. You're a teacher. You got choices. I don't." Daniel's heart broke at the truth in those words. He did get to walk away. He had choices, privileges Malik did not. But if he walked away now, if he left Malik to fight alone, then he was no better than the system that had failed him. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "Listen to me. You are not alone anymore." The next day, everything erupted. Daniel was leading his usual street lesson when the gang showed up. 4 boys, older, harder, faces carved by anger and hunger. They circled the group like wolves. One of them sneered at Daniel. "What's this? Story time for babies?" The children froze, fear written across their faces. Malik stood rigid, his fists clenched. "Come on, Malik," the leader jeered. "You don't belong here. You belong with us." Daniel rose slowly, placing himself between Malik and the gang. His voice was calm, but it carried steel. He belongs wherever he chooses. And tonight he chose here. The boys laughed, but there was no humor in it. One shoved Daniel back. Another spat on the pavement. Malik stepped forward, shaking with rage, ready to fight. But Daniel stopped him with just a hand on his shoulder. Not like this, he whispered. The standoff stretched into silence. Then the gang retreated, hurling curses as they vanished into shadows. But the threat hung heavy in the air. This wasn't over. That night, Daniel knew they had crossed a line. The street school was no longer safe. Malik was no longer safe. And so, for the first time in years, Daniel did something he had sworn never to do again. He went public. He marched into the local community center and requested to speak at their monthly meeting. The room was filled with weary faces, neighbors tired of empty promises. When Daniel stood before them, chalk dust still on his hands, his voice rang with urgency. "I am a teacher," he began. "I lost my classroom once, but I found another on the streets. And in that classroom, I see children who are brilliant, capable, desperate to learn. But they're being hunted, pulled into gangs, written off before they even get a chance. And I can't fight this battle alone." The room fell silent. Some shook their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably. But then, slowly, voices rose. A mother spoke up. "My boy comes to your class. He reads now. He never did before." Another, "My daughter says she wants to be like you." The momentum built, a wave rising. By the time Daniel stepped down, a community was standing with him. But the real battle still lay ahead. Days later, Malik came running breathless, fear wide in his eyes. "They said it's tonight," he gasped. "They're coming for me." Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and followed Malik through a maze of streets until they reached the block where the gang gathered. Shadows moved under the glow of the streetlights, laughter sharp and cruel. Daniel stepped forward, his voice carrying across the night. "Enough!" The gang turned. The leader smirked. "You again." "This boy doesn't belong to you," Daniel said firmly. "He belongs to himself. And I won't let you take that from him." The silence that followed was suffocating. Malik's heart pounded. The gang members sneered, ready to strike. And then neighbors emerged. One by one, they appeared from doorways, alleys, windows. Mothers, fathers, children. A whole community standing in the night, bearing witness. The gang faltered. Their power had always thrived on fear, on silence. But now, confronted by a wall of faces, they hesitated. The leader spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and walked away. The others followed. Malik stood, trembling. Daniel placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. But in his heart he knew it was only the beginning. The night the gang walked away, the street was never the same again. For months, Daniel had taught in the shadows, always looking over his shoulder, never sure if his little classroom on the cracked pavement would survive another week. But that night, when the neighbors stepped outside, when dozens of quiet, tired faces stood together to protect Malik, something shifted. Fear no longer owned the block. And for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to believe that what they were building wasn't temporary. It could last. The morning after, Malik walked beside him silently. His shoulders were still tense, his steps uncertain. But there was something new in his eyes, a flicker of safety. "Why'd they listen to you?" Malik asked finally. Daniel shook his head. "They didn't listen to me. They listened to themselves. They remembered who they are. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them." Malik looked down, processing. Then, with the smallest smile, "Guess you're not just a teacher." Daniel chuckled softly. "Guess I'm not." Word of what happened spread quickly. The street school, once ignored, became the talk of the neighborhood. Parents who had been skeptical began sending their children. Strangers stopped to listen. Volunteers showed up with notebooks, pencils, and warm food. And then came the reporters. At first, Daniel resisted them. Cameras had once ruined his life. When the school board fired him, when the papers painted him as reckless, when his reputation was stripped away piece by piece. But one evening, a reporter asked him a simple question. "Why do you keep teaching when you have nothing?" Daniel glanced at the children gathered around him, chalk dusting their fingers, eyes wide with curiosity. He thought of Malik, standing taller now, still scarred but unbroken. He thought of the community, beginning to breathe again after years of suffocation. And he answered, "Because education is the one thing they can't steal from us. And if I can give that even one child, then I have everything I need. The story aired that week. Within days, strangers across the city were donating supplies. An old library offered space for lessons. A local cafe provided hot meals. Slowly, the cracks in the pavement were replaced with walls, desks, and a roof. The street classroom became a real classroom. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in Daniel. It was in Malik. The boy who once stood with clenched fists now carried books. The boy who said he had no choices now helped younger kids sound out words, drawing lines in chalk as Daniel once had for him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming. One afternoon, Daniel caught Malik sketching in a notebook. It wasn't math or reading. It was a design of a school, drawn with detail and precision. "What's this?" Daniel asked, peering over his shoulder. Malik looked embarrassed at first, then admitted, "It's what I'd build, if I could. A school where kids don't have to worry about gangs or going hungry. A school where they don't feel less." Daniel stared at the sketch, his chest tightening with pride. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Don't ever let anyone tell you this isn't possible," he said firmly, "because I believe you'll build it one day." Malik's eyes lifted, hopeful for the first time in a long time. The months turned into a year. The program grew. What started as one man with a piece of chalk became a movement. Teachers who had once doubted Daniel now joined him, inspired by his resilience. Parents volunteered. Children recruited their friends, and soon the street school became a sanctuary for hundreds. Daniel still lived without much. He still didn't have a home in the traditional sense. But he had something else. A purpose, a family built from resilience and hope. And, in a way, that was home enough. On a crisp spring afternoon, Daniel stood at the front of the newly built learning space. A modest building, nothing fancy, but filled with light. The chalkboard had been replaced with clean white walls, but he still kept one box of chalk tucked away in his briefcase, a reminder of where it all began. As the children settled into their seats, Daniel called Malik forward. The boy was taller now, older, his voice steady. "Today," Daniel said proudly, "your lesson doesn't come from me. It comes from one of you." Malik stood nervously, clutching his notebook. Then, with surprising confidence, he began teaching, explaining fractions with a clarity that made even the youngest children nod with understanding. Daniel watched from the side, his chest full. He had once thought he was saving Malik, but now he realized Malik had saved him just as much. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone, the fading sun streaming through the dusty windows. He thought back to the night he had first knelt on the pavement, drawing letters with chalk for children who had nothing else. He had been broken then, wandering without direction. But one student, one boy with clenched fists and fiery eyes, had changed everything. Daniel smiled, whispering into the quiet, "Thank you, Malik." Glowing star, and that was the beginning of something far greater than either of them had imagined. Not just a teacher, not just a student, but a legacy, born on the streets, carried into the future. The sound of chalk scratching against pavement was long gone. In its place were the hum of students reading aloud, the shuffle of pencils across paper, and the low murmur of parents gathering outside the modest classroom, waiting to pick up their children. What began as a few children huddled around Daniel on the sidewalk had grown into something that no one could ignore. The city had started to notice. At first, it was just local reporters. They ran short stories about the homeless teacher who refused to quit. But then bigger outlets picked it up. Articles with headlines like, "Once cast aside, teacher brings hope to the streets." "Education without walls, how one man is rewriting the future." And then came the interview requests. Daniel didn't like the attention. Cameras still made his palms sweat, a reminder when he'd been painted as reckless and unstable by the very system that fired him. But he couldn't deny what the coverage brought. Boxes of supplies arriving daily, donations from strangers he'd never meet, letters from children in other cities who said, "I wish we had a teacher like you." The movement had outgrown him. One evening, after class, Malik approached him holding a stack of envelopes. "What's all this?" Daniel asked. "Letters," Malik replied. His voice carried a hint of pride. "From people everywhere. Some from kids, some from teachers. They're talking about us. Daniel opened one. A teacher in Detroit wrote, "You reminded me why I started teaching in the first place. I was ready to quit, but your story gave me strength." Another from a child in Texas. "I showed my mom your school. She said if he can do it on the street, maybe I could do it too." Daniel's eyes blurred as he read. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about possibility. But the biggest shift came when universities started calling. At first, it was an offer to partner, but soon it turned into something larger. Workshops, mentorship programs, even scholarships for the very children who once sat cross-legged on cracked concrete. Malik, now 16, was the first to be offered one. When the letter came, he stared at it for a long time, silent. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. "I don't deserve this," he muttered. Daniel put a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've earned every word of it. Do you know how many kids will follow you now? You're proof that this works." Malik swallowed hard, emotion breaking through his usual guarded exterior. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't dictated by fear. The classroom grew too small. Parents began pushing for more space. Volunteers turned into organizers. Organizers turned into advocates. Before long, the city council was forced to respond. Some tried to dismiss Daniel as a feel-good story that didn't solve systemic problems. But when the council chambers filled with parents, children, and supporters holding signs that read, "Education belongs to everyone," and "From the streets to the future," the conversation changed. And in the middle of it all was Malik, no longer the angry, guarded boy who had once clenched his fist at the world. He now spoke clearly, powerfully. "We're not asking for charity," Malik told the council. "We're demanding what every child deserves. And if it took a homeless man with a piece of chalk to prove it, then shame on all of you for waiting this long." The room went silent. Cameras flashed. And Daniel, standing at the back, felt his chest swell with something more than pride. This was bigger than him now. Malik had become the voice. The story spread nationally. Documentaries were filmed. Donations poured in. What was once a street school became an education movement. Programs opening in other neighborhoods, inspired by Daniel's resilience and Malik's defiance. And then came the day Daniel least expected. The governor called. At first, Daniel thought it was some kind of mistake. But when he sat in the State House, surrounded by officials and policymakers, he realized how far things had come. They weren't asking him for a token speech. They wanted him at the table, shaping policy for underserved communities. "Mr. Daniels," one official said, "you've proven that education doesn't need walls, but it does need heart. We want to bring your model statewide." Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of the years he'd spent invisible, sleeping under bridges, teaching with nothing but scraps. And now, the very system that once erased him was asking for his guidance. He gave his answer simply. "I'll do it, but only if we don't forget where this started. On the streets, with the kids everyone gave up on." Months later, the city unveiled a new community learning center. A banner stretched across the entrance, the Johnson Initiative for Education Equity. Daniel protested the name, but the community refused to change it. To them, he wasn't just a teacher. He was a man who proved that one person's determination could break chains of neglect and despair. On opening day, hundreds gathered. Parents cried. Children clapped. Malik, standing tall beside Daniel, whispered, "You did it." Daniel shook his head gently. "We did it, and we're just getting started." That night, long after the crowd had gone, Daniel walked the empty halls of the new building. His footsteps echoed softly, reminding him of the silence of the streets where it all began. He paused at the chalkboard in the front room. Someone had written in bold, uneven letters, "Thank you for believing in us." Daniel smiled, tracing the words with his fingertips. His journey had been broken, painful, and uncertain, but had led here, to light, to hope, to change. And deep down, he knew one truth would always remain. It wasn't just about him. It was about every child who would one day walk through these doors carrying nothing but potential and walk out with everything they needed. The years had passed, yet the memory of cracked sidewalks and chalk-drawn lessons never left Daniel. No matter how polished a new learning center became, its glass walls, its sleek technology, its proud name, Daniel often returned to the streets where it had all begun. He would stand quietly, staring at the spot near the corner store where he had once crouched, surrounded by children desperate for hope. The world had changed around him. He had become a symbol, a name spoken in boardrooms, classrooms, and even political chambers. But inside, he remained the same man who had once held on to a single piece of chalk as if it were the last lifeline he had. Malik had grown too. Now in his early 20s, he was no longer the angry, restless teenager Daniel first met. He was a scholar, a leader, and an advocate. He had gone from a boy with clenched fists to a man with an open hand, reaching back to pull others forward. On the day of his college graduation, Daniel sat in the audience, watching as Malik crossed the stage. His name echoed across the auditorium, followed by thunderous applause. Malik's cap and gown swayed slightly as he shook hands with professors, his face lit with a mixture of pride and disbelief. When the ceremony ended, Malik found Daniel in the crowd. They didn't need words. A simple embrace said everything. For Daniel, it wasn't just pride. It was proof that one child could change everything. And through that one child, countless others. Over time, Malik became a public voice for equity. He spoke not just of his own journey, but of Daniel's. He carried his mentor's name into every room he entered, making sure the story was never forgotten. At a national education conference, Malik stood before thousands of teachers and officials. His voice, steady and powerful, carried across the hall. I was a boy written off by the world. My teacher had nothing, no classroom, no books, no roof over his head. But he had belief. He believed in me when no one else did. That belief didn't just save me. It saved every child who came after me. Because when one teacher refuses to give up, generations change. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding. Daniel, sitting quietly in the back row, felt tears prick his eyes. The boy he once saved was now saving others. The movement continued to grow. Across the nation, schools and programs modeled after Daniel's approach began popping up in underserved neighborhoods. They were not fancy. They were not rich. But they were alive, with teachers who remembered what it meant to believe in the child before them. Documentaries were made. Books were written. But the heart of the story remained simple. A teacher, homeless and broken, who gave everything to children with nothing. Years later, as Daniel grew older, he often walked the halls of the learning center that bore his name. Children still filled the rooms, their laughter bouncing against the walls. Parents still gathered at the doors, hopeful and proud. And every so often, Daniel would sit with a group of students and tell them the story, not himself, but of Malik. Once, he would begin, there was a boy who thought the world had forgotten him, but he found his voice, and when he did, he made sure the world heard it. The children would listen with wide eyes, not realizing until later that the story of Malik and Daniel was the very ground they stood on. When Daniel finally passed, the community mourned deeply. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was a continuation of it. At his memorial, hundreds gathered, students, teachers, parents, officials. The crowd stretched so far it spilled into the streets where his first classroom had once been. Malik stood at the podium, older now, but still carrying the same fire. His voice cracked as he spoke. Daniel wasn't just my teacher. He was my lifeline. He showed me that the measure of a teacher is not the size of the classroom, but the size of the heart. His lessons will never die, because they live in us. And as long as one child is still searching for hope, we will carry his chalk and write their future. The audience fell silent. Then, one by one, children began raising pieces of chalk high in the air. White dust against blue sky. A sea of hands lifted in honor. It was no longer just Daniel's symbol. It belonged to all of them. And so, the legacy lived on. Every chalkboard that was filled, every book that was opened, every child that dared to dream. It all traced back to one man on a broken street corner. One teacher who refused to quit. One student who refused to let the story end. Together, they prove that education isn't a privilege. It's a right. And sometimes, the smallest classroom can leave the biggest mark on the world.